So in this video, we're looking at bodily integrity, body, mind and spirit, and the concept of ahimsa, causing no harm. And it's Phil in Thailand and me in England to have the discussion today. So Phil, your computer's getting very hot, isn't it? So we probably need to...
It will do. It will do.
Yeah.
So I might disappear briefly, yeah.
So the temperature in England is... Temperature in England is 16. I think the temperature in Thailand is...
it feels like it's about 34, 33, 34.
How wonderful.
Yeah. No arthritis.
Yeah, well, yeah, I suffer from that over here. I'm sure I do. Every time it gets cold and damp. So, I mean, the values we've got up there today, the bodily integrity. The bodily integrity came very much from the World Freedom Alliance, our charter, the sort of overall charter for the whole organisation. And this particularly provoked by the fact that people were being forced to wear masks and forced to have vaccinations against their will in many cases, and even forcibly given vaccinations in some countries. And so that is there just to protect that in any of our institutions, any of our learning places, then we will not allow that. People's bodily integrity is sacrosanct. So I think that one's fairly clear, actually. I don't think there's any argument about that. I would love to debate that with people who think it is okay to vaccinate someone against their will, because clearly there are people in the world who do believe that.
Yes.
But let's focus today really on the idea of body, mind and spirit, because I know you and I are really keen on those subjects being learnt. I think I would say learnt rather than taught, because I think those are things that you learn. And the idea of ahimsa, which was something that you brought into our discussions a lot when we were talking about the education charter. Did you want to start off on that one, Phil, actually?
Well, what I like about ahimsa is that when I first read about it, it wasn't, you know, Sanskrit, like many languages, when you translate from one language to the other, you don't always get the full cultural meaning that comes through. Now, ahimsa, it literally translates as non-violence, but arguably, unless you're a psychopath, nobody intends to be violent. So this is really quite important. And when I first read about ahimsa, it was translated, I don't remember the exact words, but the concept I got was proactively pursuing a life of non-violence. Now, that seemed to me important, because to be proactively pursuing it requires you to be in the moment, conscious, you know, living consciously, and not through the ego and all its reactions and to triggers and all that sort of thing. So ahimsa is almost like a commitment, a conscious commitment that you don't want to be violent. Now, most people, you know, in these days, then that doesn't mean hitting somebody. It means violent in speech and attitude, I suppose. So I think, to me, ahimsa is a proactive pursuing of speaking in a non-violent way, and that would include thinking as well, because thoughts usually precede language, and it will, of course, just as importantly, include to myself as well as other people. So shame and guilt and anxiety and all these things which I think are prevalent in our modern world, they are like a form of violence against oneself. Now, obviously, another part of the conversation is why that's the case and why we are feeling like that. So yeah, I think ahimsa is excellent, because it makes the person think about what it means, and then they say, okay, right, now I'm going to pursue it. So it almost acts as like a bit of a mindset shift. You know, to shift our mindset requires a conscious thought. And if somebody's deciding, yes, I like that concept, I'm going to try hard not to say unkind things, blah, 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 blah. And then, of course, when you do it, you will be able to notice that you've done it. So that's to me why I like ahimsa so much.
And it reminded me, I was treating a 7-year-old the other day, and we were getting on really well, me and this little lad. And at one point, I said something about being fat. And he stopped me and he held me and he said, Nigel, you really shouldn't use that word about yourself. He said, you're criticizing yourself using that word. And it almost made me burst into tears. He said, you must be much kinder to yourself. And it was like, wow, out of the mouth of babes. It was a beautiful lesson to learn from a 7-year-old. It was great. And I think the violence that we put on ourselves is often reflected in the violence that we put on other people. And when I was a teacher, I worked in a school, and my role was, I was teacher in charge of the EBD unit, which is a unit for children with emotional and behavioural difficulties. So these were quite extreme young people with extreme violence. And I got to know them really well. And they are violent to other human beings. I mean, physically, they will physically attack other human beings, a lot of them. And yet when you listen to them, and when you learn to love them as human beings, you find that they're much more violent to themselves than they are to others. And one of the quotes I like best from Harvey Jackins actually is, these kids need a damn good listening to. Such a beautiful thing. And it doesn't mean that we excuse their violence towards others, or say it's okay to be violent towards others. That implicitly in ahimsa, it isn't. It isn't okay to be violent towards other people. And yet the perpetrators of that violence, especially when they're young, especially if they're in one of our learning places, then we need to work out ways of conveying that love of themselves and love of others as well. So non-violence towards others and non-violence towards yourself. And I think if we can get that right in our learning places, that's going to be transformational for the world.
And I didn't, that was interesting. That so they were violent towards others, but when you worked with them, they redirected the violence towards themselves. Is that because somebody was showing them love, so they didn't want to hurt that other person? Is that what was happening?
Because I would use counselling with the children when I was working with them, and was very kind and very patient and very thoughtful most of the time. And occasionally I'm not perfect, and occasionally I not lost my temper. Actually, I don't ever remember losing my temper with them, but they would wind me up sometimes, because these kids have learned how to do that. They're genius at it. And occasionally I'd find myself, I'd feel the hackles rising. But most of the time I didn't. Most of the time I managed to rise above what they were trying to goad me into, and remain the adult, and remain calm and kind and thoughtful. And when the children, and what they would often do in that situation, when you show them that love, because what they experience at home often is violence, physical violence. A lot of them have experienced physical violence at home, which they then act out on other people. And yet when you get to the heart of them, they hate themselves because they're like that. They really hate being like that. And they hate themselves, they hate their actions. And I mean, I would have children who would swear at somebody, really sort of foul language. And we would then sit down and we would talk about it. And the child would say, yes, but I was trying not to hit him. I was trying not to, so I called him a whatever it was. It's like, when you understand that this child was actually, they were doing their absolute best to cause no harm. Yeah. And in doing so, used a word that the teacher was offended by, or other children were offended by, but did not act out the really violent, and some of these children were murderously violent. They didn't act out on that. So they were, in one level, practicing ahimsa, because they had this violent rage inside them, and yet they were doing their absolute best not to act on it.
So they wanted to practice ahimsa, but something inside them is resisting that effort. So is there a battle going on inside them? In other words, you've created, with your talking and counselling, you've created an environment which has made them want to not be violent, but something then it didn't work, and they then, or if they weren't violent to another person, they turned inwards. So in other words, it seems that even when they wanted to not be violent, they still were, even if it wasn't externally, it went inside. So if that's the case, what is it that makes them violent?
I mean, I would say all of the children that I had in my unit who were violent, and all the children in primary schools that I've worked with who have been violent, experienced violence outside the school setting. So they all had very violent homes. And I mean, to the extent that sometimes when their fathers or mothers would come into the school, they were really frightening people, because you could sense the level of violence this poor little child had been born into, and that they're born into those homes as babies, and then they experience just incredible violence. In fact, one of my patients at the moment, he has been to prison. I think by the age of 25, he'd been to prison 4 times for violence. And when I'm treating him, during our treatments, he's talked to me about his early childhood and the levels of violence against him, the numbers of times that his dad tried to kill him as a toddler, and strangled him and threw him against the wall. And it's like, wow, this is a lot to handle. And and when you're dealing with that, I mean, we're talking at the extreme end here, aren't we? This is the absolute extreme. But when you've experienced that as an infant, and that becomes your model of how to behave in the world, because that's how you see everyone around you, you suddenly find yourself in a learning space where you're not even allowed to swear, let alone beat people up when you're angry with them. And it's like that, the confusion there is, that's something that we're going to have to think about, I think, in terms of our education charter.
Well, you see, that's the thing. And the violent father, presumably himself had a violent father.
Yes,
and
yeah, you told me about that too.
So this is what I talk about, that basically where the humanity is stuck in an intergenerational cycle of a vicious cycle.
Yes.
And so, okay, we're talking about the extreme end, but it's instructive at the psychological level for all levels of violence, even if it's just being nasty with words. I've always said that if you're a happy person, you won't be in the business of hurting other people. Flipping that around, if you are hurting other people, that strongly suggests that you are hurt yourself. And yes, the next thing is that if we've got X number, if we're stuck in this intergenerational vicious cycle, we're stuck in it until there's a 1 generation intervention.
Yeah.
And so then we come back to educating the educators, which is what Krishnamurti said for decades. And yes, Mark Twain talks about poor schooling. So it comes back to the schooling. And you know, I was on another call yesterday. I'm on a connecting consciousness calls, and we're in the Thailand chapter. And you know, I was talking about the learning and the schooling and so on again. And then one of the women on there, she I think she's about 50, and she homeschools her 2 kids in Bali or somewhere in Indonesia. And she comes from Switzerland. She was talking about a rural village school in Switzerland, which had a psychopath teacher, a paedophile teacher. And this was just in the country, where she said you would expect to get a nice school. And this is since I was at school. So, you know, this goes on, and children are violated against by the parents and the teachers who themselves were violated against. So, you know, if we know that this is the problem, and if we know this is the root cause, then we know what the solution is. But then the next step is implementing the solution.
Yes.
And that's not necessarily the difficult bit, but until we do what Krishnamurti said, which is educate the educators, perhaps we can't escape the cycle, or it just takes so long to do that. Meanwhile, we've got all the other dangers with medical mafia and so on.
Yeah.
And sorry, that might explain why we have all these medical mafia kind of things, because the people in charge and people in leadership positions are hurt people.
Yeah. one of the words I wrote down earlier on, actually, we were talking about children. In my head, we were talking about children suppressing anger. And I had one young lad, and his mother would regularly try and kill herself. So he would come into school. We didn't know that she'd tried to kill herself that night, and he'd spent the whole evening in accident and emergency with his stepdad and his mum in a room, not knowing if she was going to wake up in the morning. And then he'd be brought to school the next day, and they'd never think to tell us because it happened so regularly. It was almost like a popping down the shops event for him. But for him, as a human being, it was absolutely devastating. And one day he used to come into school in a taxi. A lot of the children that I was responsible for came in a taxi, and he disappeared. He just disappeared. We couldn't find him. So I went all around the school. And eventually, I didn't think he'd run off the premises because it would have been difficult to do that. But I found a little box in the corner of a room, and I opened the box, and he'd curled himself up like a fetus in the box. Now, I knew nothing about the suicide attempt or anything like that. And I just saw this crumpled little figure in a box. And so I just gently spoke to him, and eventually got him to say what had happened, and he'd spent the night in A&E, and his mother had tried to kill herself again. And he said, I'm so angry about it. He said, but I'm on Ritalin. They gave him Ritalin for this ADHD that he allegedly had, although he was never tested for it or anything, but he was on this drug every day of his life. And he said, the drug makes me feel like I'm stuck in a cage and cannot be myself. So he was desperate to get these feelings out, but because of the Ritalin, he was unable to get his feelings out. It completely damped him down. And there's a whole generation now, the numbers of children across the world who are on medication for their behavior, whereas actually their behavior is a reflection of the society that they're in and the experiences that they're having. And the word we use in the counselling I do is discharge. They need to discharge those feelings safely with somebody who loves them. And that involves, in his case, crying and shaking and raging even. I had a punch bag in my room. The kids could rage on the punch bag. That's what he needed to be doing. Not having a drug to suppress it all down and imply that there's something wrong with him. There's nothing wrong with him. He's just reacting to the fact that every few weeks his mother would try to kill herself. And that was quite interesting how he perceived the Ritalin, because I've never liked the idea of drugging children, because I always think that there's a reason behind their behavior. And if we can find the reason, then we can allow them to take charge of their behavior, which he found really difficult to do.
Well, you know, you've brought us back to the beginning, which is bodily integrity, and there's a pill for every ill. And because humanity, in my view, has perverted its intelligence, you know, the kids are given pills, the kids are given lots of jabs. You know, I mean, even before COVID came along, you know, my research told me that American kids, by the time they were 18, had about 72 vaccinations for this, that, and the other. 16 different diseases and all the booster shots and so on. And, you know, that's breaking the contract with natural life. These kids that you're talking about, where they're violent and physically violent, they've been physically attacked with pills, and they've been mentally attacked with you know, violent homes and mothers and all that sort of thing. So you know, the body, I don't know. It seems to me that in the Western thinking, the body and the mind are two separate things, and you are separate to me, and that person over there is separate. In other words, in our psyche, we subconsciously view ourselves as a separate person to everything else.
Yes. And
within us, there's the mind and the body, which are separate. And a lot of scientists, a lot of people won't even acknowledge any soul at all. Yes. So you know, we are, and I always talk about humanity, we've broken our bodily integrity, we've smashed our mental and psychological integrity, and we've spiritually emptied ourselves, and we don't even, so many people say there's no such thing as a soul. So what I'm saying lately a lot is that humanity has perverted its intelligence. It's almost like it fell out of love with itself. And so consequently, out of 7.5 billion or 8 billion people, most people are struggling and suffering. And you see, I saw all this in the 90s when I used to go back to England from Thailand. I used to see people in Thailand with much less, but more smiles, more laughter, and more tolerance. Now, you scratch the belly and you go under the surface, you see things that you might not normally see. But nevertheless, I think that a lot of humans' problems are unnecessary, in that I don't think it's human nature, it's the human nurture. And it comes back to our favorite topic, what's going on in the schools. Now, just to finish that, okay, people will say, well, it's not the teachers, it's the parents, but the parents learned at schools. So somewhere, you know, schooling is the focus of education, and education is the human focus of change. So that's where we have to begin with the solution. And it's not to blame the parents or the teachers, but all these integrities are busted by humans who are malfunctioning. And a lot of it is because of Ritalins and drugs and pills and chemicals, not just in the pills, but in the foods as well. Our food chain is shocking. So we've got a lot of repair work to do. And meanwhile, these children who are defenseless are, well, it's too sad to put into words, really.
Yes. That brings us nicely on to the last little bit that we were talking about today, but we have been talking about it, is the concept of body, mind, and spirit. And we talked this round a lot when we were designing the charter, I remember. And this just seemed like the nicest way. I agree with you. There is no separation between those three. This is just a physical body which holds the emotions and the spirit for me. I mean, when I'm treating as a cranial osteopath and I put my hands onto somebody, it's body, mind, and spirit. And in the West, we split those into 3 different things. When I've got my hands on a little 18-month-old baby like I did last night, who was fast asleep and I was treating him, that was body, mind, and spirit just encapsulated in my hands last night. And the whole point of that value is, because people often say to me, well, what is the World Freedom Alliance curriculum going to be? And I don't want one. I fundamentally do not want a curriculum. The curriculum is the values. It must be drawn from the values. It must be drawn from the interests, because we've got the sovereignty of the learner. And yet within that, we want them to understand that we have a body, we have a mind, so we can understand our emotions, we can be emotionally intelligent, and that must be absolutely fundamental to what's going on in our learning places, and an acknowledgement that there is a spiritual aspect and a spiritual dimension as well. I'm very keen for us to start putting out videos and finding information about how we spiritually develop children, because I know when we first started talking about the education focus group for the World Freedom Alliance, there was a woman in the Netherlands who teaches children to read with blindfolds on, because they can perceive the book using extrasensory perception. And we have these amazing gifts, which is not mumbo jumbo or mystical. It is scientifically proven that we can do these things. And yet science has almost, I mean, you talked about it all being separated off, as if that science, you can't have science and spirituality. Well, of course you can. And another example of that is, I was watching Netflix the other day, and it suddenly came up with one of my comic heroes, Ricky Gervais, and he did a whole sketch around how he was mocking the fact that people use prayer to get rid of cancer, and saying, well, I'd rather get my chemotherapy than prayer. Well, he hasn't looked at the science then. He hasn't looked at the research, because the research shows that when you pray over people, even without their knowledge, in fact, that's important that it is without their knowledge, they clinically significantly get better more than people who have not been prayed over. So even the science backs that up. So this dichotomy between science and spirituality is ludicrous. And in our learning places, we want to use science to investigate our spiritual and extrasensory abilities, because we've got them, and they've been suppressed deliberately over years.
Yeah, the way I view it is that spirituality, and people have different views of what it is, but spirituality is bringing back together science and religion. So science and religion was split hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, whatever, and spirituality is putting them back together, because being spiritual to me is living in harmony, which means recognizing the holistic web of life. Now, when they say what's going to be on the curriculum, you see, if you asked me what would be on my curriculum, and this is, I don't know if you've thought about this, or because it's never on any curriculum. Skills, literally skills of here. So on my curriculum, there's the learning skill, there's the communication skills, and then there's leadership skills. But basically, as a language teacher, what I discovered without knowing what I was doing back in the 90s, I'm inviting and creating conditions to get other humans to speak and want to speak. Now, if you're going to speak, you've got to have something to speak about, and you're not going to speak about something that bores you. So this is how I learned my teaching, was I have to make learning happen. So when I'm making learning happen, there's writings going on, speaking's going on, debating's going on, clarifying, arguing, disagreeing, compromising, the whole lot, the whole caboodle, listening, skimming, scanning, reading critically, all these things are going on. So, and then of course you've got to read something, you've got to listen to something, or YouTube, you've got to choose a topic. So you've mentioned spirituality and science and so on. You see, now what we've got, Nigel, is we've got epigenetics, and Bruce Lipton's the big man on that. And so that is like a spiritual science, if you like. In the 90s, in the 80s, I think you had Krishnamurti, and I think I've mentioned it before, in a series of YouTube videos talking with David Bohm.
Yes.
Who was Einstein considered him a successor in physics. And so, and the interesting thing with David Bohm coming at understanding life through his scientific training, Krishnamurti coming at his understanding through his spiritual training, they arrived at exactly the same place, which was the holistic nature. So that to me was the marriage of everything into one. Now, just to finish on that, 6,000 years ago, they developed Ayurveda in India, which is the healthcare or health and lifestyle approach to living. Now, I maintain if everybody knew their Ayurveda at a basic level, our world would be unrecognizable. There would be no violence. Ahimsa would be natural. So, if I'm on a curriculum, I say to myself, well, what's the basics that everybody needs? And then they choose what they're going to learn and what they're going to be skilled at. So in my curriculum, there's going to be learning skills, and there's going to be communication skills, which encompasses lots of sub-skills, and there's going to be health and wellness. And in the health and wellness, you've then got, quantum physics, you've got epigenetics, the biology, you've got Ayurveda, you've got all those sorts of things. And when people have the self-knowledge and they understand how the body works and how the mind works, and you develop your, and then if you're not being filled up with crappy foods and chemicals, your soul will flourish and your love and heart will flourish. So bodily integrity, when that is pierced, there is no soul, because if you're in pain, how can you get to your soul? So yeah, mind, body and spirit, all one thing. But when I wrote my book and I was trying to think, how can I get people to understand all of this? I had to split them all. Yes. Into separate zones so people could understand. But then I said at the end, don't forget to put them back again. And that's what went wrong somewhere hundreds of years ago. We split things in our pursuit of greater understanding, forgot to put them back together again.
Yes. And the image I have in my head then, I had several images trying to understand what you were saying there. And one of them was you've got trees behind you. So we could just call that nature, or we could call it, we could give that tree a name, and then the ones in the background another name. We could give the grass a name, and it's just as beautiful when you separate it all out into its own parts. But it's all nature. It's all beautiful and it's harmonious and integrated and working together as well. And that kind of, for me, is what a curriculum should do. I don't mind breaking things down into smaller chunks. In fact, I think it's a good way to learn things, just break it down into smaller chunks, but always having the big picture in mind, that you know where it fits with everything else. And I loved what you were saying, because I was thinking about the idea of skills and and then how you examine people as well. I think we've discussed this before on other videos, where if I need brain surgery because I've had an accident, a bullet's gone in my head or something, I want somebody who knows how my brain works going in there to take the bullet out so that they don't do any damage. And so there has to be, in this ideal world that we're creating, there has to be an understanding and an intelligence about how the physiology of the body works, and that person needs to be able to demonstrate that. Well, one of the ways we did it, both when I was training to be a teacher actually, and when I was training to be an osteopath, was skills profiles. So we had a profile. These are all the skills you're going to need. Well, these are the core skills you're going to need to be a teacher. And then we had to be able to show when we had achieved that. So I can't think of any of them at the moment, but let's say even just knowledge about the body in osteopathy. So know the muscles of the leg and what they attach to and what nerve supplies them and things like that. Well, there's a list you can tick off. You can say, yes, I know these are the different muscles in the thigh, these are the muscles on the inner thigh, and so you can use a skill-based ongoing assessment of knowledge. So I'm quite comfortable with the idea that there are examinations. I don't like the way examinations are done at the moment, because I think it's stupid just to put someone under pressure. In the UK at the moment, we're in A-level. I treated a person who's doing right in the middle of her A-levels at the moment, and it's crazy that she's got to prove everything she's learned in 2 years just like that in an hour. That's daft. That's really stupid. That's just, I don't even know what that's testing, but it's certainly not testing her knowledge of psychology or whatever she's doing her A-levels in. An ongoing assessment where you demonstrate what you've been learning. And I love when I was a student in Moscow, all of our exams were oral exams. So you sat in a room and you talked to people, and if they thought you possibly understood the answer, they would ask you a different way to give you an opportunity to answer. And I thought that was a brilliant. I've never experienced that in England, where I was first taught. I hadn't experienced oral exams until then, but in Russia it was quite standard. You would have an oral exam. You'd be able to show what you had learned. So I think we need to be really intelligent around that as well. So for me, the curriculum, mind, body, spirit, I think you nailed it in what you were saying, that it needs to encompass all those different knowledges we have. So I love the idea of people learning epigenetics and homeopathy and Ayurveda, and why not, we'll teach them osteopathy and cranial osteopathy as well, and give them this knowledge of how we can keep ourselves healthy, rather than, as you said earlier on, popping pills. We're ill, we pop a pill. It's crazy, absolutely crazy system we've got ourselves into.
Well, I think also that the thing about knowledge is that that's what's on the curriculums, and we need knowledge. A surgeon needs knowledge, and all the different people need knowledge. But like food, we consume the knowledge, and we have to discern it and interpret it and understand it. Now that is the skill aspect of it. So that comes back to the learning skills and the communication skills. So for example, I always used to say, if I go into my language class and with Thai students and I immediately start off boring them, the attention's gone. And when the attention's gone, no learning, finished. There can't be anything. So the attention is the beginning, and it must be motivating and it must be interesting enough for them to keep attention. So these are part of the learning skills. So that's a teaching skill, to make sure that the learners are paying attention. And and that disappears almost immediately in most schools. So the knowledge is one thing, but not nobody, but generally in the school system, there's no thought given towards the consumption of the knowledge and the digestion of it, if you like. And it's quite useful to use those words for knowledge, because now this is what happens with the media. People consume the media and it's all negative. It's like McDonald's and Dunkin' Donuts every single day, and there's no decent, so it's all shitty foods and it's all shitty media, and it's all because that's what we got at school. So the curriculum, I'm always a bit concerned about no curriculum. I think I know what you mean, that it shouldn't be pushed on anybody, but I think what we need is we need the foundational toolbox, if you like, that all humans need. Now, Mother Eagle doesn't cut the wings of baby eagles so that the baby eagle can't learn to fly, but that's what we're doing to ourselves as humans.
Yeah.
So I think when we focus on the skills in our curriculum, that naturally leads to knowledge, because you can't practice communication without talking about something, and knowledge, you can't really acquire knowledge without using skills to acquire it. So they need to come together, and I think that should be a focus on our education charter, and you know, anybody joining, that's what it's all about. And I notice this when we talk in the World Freedom Alliance meetings and everything, it's all about knowledge. And because nobody's ever been taught about skills, nobody's giving that a consideration, which is understandable. But until we do, we're one hand behind our backs, I think.
You've convinced me in this conversation, actually, that needs to be our next task. Well, our next task is kind of how we educate the educators, but also this idea of perhaps we do need a core skills almost, and not the way core skills are taught in the UK at the moment, which is just ridiculous things that the children are supposed to learn off by heart. They're not skills at all, but the way you were describing the communication skills, the leadership skills, that would be amazing actually to have. And we could even have, I was thinking, our own almost qualifications where people can say, look, I have attained these leadership skills, I have attained these communication skills. That would be like an ongoing assessment, and perhaps we could award people with those as well. If that, yeah, I think there's something we need to think about there, because that could be really useful.
The beautiful thing about skills, Nigel, is that when a teacher, one teacher in the practical world suddenly has said, right, okay, you're now teaching skills, it dawns on you very quickly, well, hang on a minute, I can't teach skills. The other person's got to do the skills. So I've got to do things to make them do something. So it immediately and necessarily changes the mindset of the teacher, because I can't teach you to hit a golf ball. I can't teach you to make an omelette. You've got to do it. I can guide you and I can help you and I can make it an easier or more motivating process. But ultimately speaking, you have to play the violin, you have to hit the golf ball, you have to do the cooking, you have to paint the painting.
Yes.
And so I think that when we start putting the emphasis on skills in curriculums, that will automatically start to shift the whole educational approach. It has to.
Yeah, I think you're right. You've convinced me, actually, that we have our values, and the values kind of underpin that. But then where do we go next? Well, where we go next is we then, and it'll be great when we've got this community of learning places around the world, because that's a project we could probably engage in with all of them, and just work together to work out, okay, what are the core skills? I mean, when I was a teacher in our schools, we made philosophy for children central, so discussing, debating, understanding what philosophical arguments were. And we didn't teach them, we did it. We did philosophical arguments, we didn't teach about it, we did it. And the other thing we did was teach children how to learn. So using the work of Edward de Bono, the idea of mind mapping, using colour, using repetition, using, I remember our spelling, because I like the fact I was very poor at spelling when I was young. And every week we would have a spelling test, and every week the same children would get 10, the same children would get 7, and the same children would get 3 out of 10. So they hadn't taught any of us anything, because it was just exactly the same each week. So I didn't want to repeat that when I became a teacher. So what we did was, and yeah, this sort of relates to what we've been talking about, because we had booklets throughout the school, and the government in England said, these are the words that children must be able to spell. And I looked at them and thought, yeah, fair enough. Yeah, we must be able to spell those words. That's it. If we're educated people, we need to be able to do this. So we put them all into about 30 booklets, and the children worked their way through the booklets. We taught them how to learn spelling, taught them hundreds of different ways. So they would draw the words, they would paint the words, they would draw pictures, they would use mnemonics. I can't even say it today. They would use different colors for different bits of the word. We would look at the root word, and then prefixes and suffixes, and what the word meant. And then the children had to prove to the teacher that they could spell the words in every single word in that booklet. So they would come up to any one of us and say, I can spell all the words in the booklet. So I would open the booklet and say, right, spell the word thought backwards. And they would kind of look at me and say, what do you mean backwards? I said, well, if you know it, you can see it backwards and forwards. And so they'd go off and they'd learn how to spell the words backwards and forwards. And then they'd come up to me and say, no, and I'd tick that off, and then they could go on to the next booklet. The beauty of the system was that it wasn't age related at all. So we had children aged 7 who were brilliant spellers, who had finished all the booklets. And we had children who were 11 who were still on booklet 3 because they were struggling to learn how. So we would teach them how to learn spelling. It was amazing. It was a really good system, actually. I loved doing it that way. And
they presumably enjoyed themselves.
Well, they did, because what we did in assemblies, actually, for an international audience, an assembly is where everyone in the school gets together. I would say at the beginning of the or end of the week, I think it was on the Friday assembly, I've like, anyone who's finished their spelling book this week, stand up and we'll give you a round of applause. Well, the 11-year-old who was on booklet 3 and the 7-year-old who was on booklet 30 both stood up. They both got equal praise for what they'd done, and both felt good about themselves. So it was a beautiful system, actually.
Well, I think that's an example of real learning, because the students basically being given responsibility to do the learning now. And so, you know, what the teacher's doing is enabling learning to happen. So, you know, it's not like I come in and say, right, we're going to learn how to learn today. We just go in and we do whatever we're going to do. Now, there is an opportunity to talk about the actual learning at the end, 10 minutes at the end or whatever. Okay, well, we've done 4 or 5 different tasks today. How did you get on with them? You know, well, I struggled with this one. Why? So that's like the meta conversation, or the meta talking. That's the reflection part of learning. And with the spelling, yeah, once they've got something to do, that's the transformation, because then it's motivating and the students and children are doing things. And then of course the teacher gets rewards, because things are happening as they're supposed to happen. You know, students are enjoying and being motivated and learning and achieving, and then the teacher feels good, and then now you're in a new cycle, aren't you? Yeah.
I remember the way the books were set out as well now, the different booklets were set out in different ways. So some of them were learning for word patterns. So it would be like book, look, shook, took, cook, all in a list. So the children I'd be going to the class and I'd see them, and they'd be drawing 2 little eyes for book, and then 2 little eyes for cook, and 2 little eyes for shook. So they were getting the patterns in their head and just putting a letter at the beginning and the end. And it was, the artwork around it was absolutely beautiful. Or they would write the word cook and then turn one of them into perhaps 2 eggs or a frying pan, and then book, they would write the word book on a book. And so them learning their spellings was not a horrible task. It was actually great fun, because they were kids that enjoyed art, and not all kids do, in which case not all kids would do it this way, but the ones that enjoyed doing art, their spelling booklets were covered in pictures, and they were beautifully colourful. And it was, perhaps we can have a curriculum then. We can suggest a curriculum and give people skills like that on how to teach spellings, because people are going to need to know these things, aren't they?
Well, the spellings and the basic maths and all that sort of thing. But maths can be, you can have a number of subjects which will incorporate maths and so on. But
yes,
but with with the curriculum that is based on skills, you could start, for example, with the 4 language skills, which in order that we learn them is listening, speaking, reading, and writing.
Yes.
To order we learn them as a kid, and when you look at all 4, then if you start doing a tree, coming down from there, okay, speaking, where you've got articulating yourself, you've got debating, discussing, clarifying, questioning, answering, you've got all these sub skills, and then you can do for each 4, and then each sub skill gets a further sub skill, so you realize how much is actually going on without even talking about it going on. And what's happening is all we're doing is we're just tapping into the innate humanness of who we are. These are the skills that we're born with. Yes. But what's happening is the schools are blocking them. Yes. So we spend 12 years teaching children to get to a certain stage. You could probably do it in 2 or 3 years if you did a skills-based one, and they have to learn certain knowledge, which is your self-knowledge. How does the body work? If you know how the body works, you're not going to harm it. And if you know how you are connected to the planet, and you harm the planet and you're harming yourself, well, you're not going to harm the planet. And if you harm yourself, you're harming the planet. So with that knowledge, all this bodily integrity increases, and everything increases because you've got that basic self-knowledge, which is not taught. We come out of school, we don't know how our body works, we don't know how the mind works, and we don't know how the world works. So what do we know?
That has probably encapsulated the whole discussion, actually, because we come right back to the beginning where we started talking about bodily integrity. And for you to say what you just said was really profound, because bodily integrity isn't this body, it's this body, this universe that we're in. Yes. So we do no harm to that by doing no harm to this. And like a fractal, it's sort of every level, at every single level of our thought. And
here's a comparison for you. When we damage the waterways, we damage our own blood. When we damage the air, when we pollute the air, we pollute our own lungs. And when we pollute the ground, we're polluting our own flesh and bones, and vice versa. So if people get that connection, that's transformative.
Yeah.
Because nobody consciously wants to harm themselves, do they? So we come back to ahimsa again as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Beautiful. This has been a fantastic discussion. We're going to end it there because people can't listen for more than an hour, but I could go on forever talking about this. We're going to have to meet at some point, Phil, because these long distance conversations are great, but I'd love to sort of really sit down with you and have a sort of like a time where we really discuss things together. But no, it's been fantastic as always. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.